tape around the energy transition and shift fossil fuel subsidies to support vulnerable households and boost renewable energy investments. And governments must support the people, communities and sectors most affected with social protection schemes and alternative jobs and livelihoods. Fourth, private and multilateral finance for the green energy transition must be scaled up. Renewable energy investments need to increase by a factor of 7 to meet the net zero goal, according to the International Energy Agency. And multilateral development banks need to take more risks, help countries set up the right regulatory frameworks, and modernize their power grids and mobilize private finance at scale. And I urge shareholders in those banks to exercise their rights and to make sure that they are fit for purpose. Today's report expands on these ideas, and Rebecca Greenspan will elaborate on them in a moment. But, ladies and gentlemen of the media, every country is part of this energy crisis, and all countries are paying attention to what others are doing. There is no place for hypocrisy. Developing countries don't lack reasons to invest in renewables. Many of them are living with the severe impact of the climate crisis, including storms, wildfires, floods, and droughts. What they lack are concrete, workable options. And meanwhile, developed countries are urging them to invest in renewables without providing enough social, technical, or financial support. And some of those same developed countries are introducing universal subsidies at gas stations, while others are reopening coal plants. It is difficult to justify such steps, even on a temporary basis. But if they are pursued, such policies must be strictly time-bound and targeted to ease the burden on the energy poor and the most vulnerable during the fastest possible transition to renewables. Thank you.
Thank you very much. No, we'll go to Rebecca Greenspan. Rebecca, you on?
Yes, here I am. Do you hear me well?
Perfect. Please go ahead, Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary-General, for your strong message and leadership, and for accompanying us once more today. Good morning, everyone. Let me thank you first, the task team on energy, part of the 3 streams that have been working in these briefs. And I want to thank Milola Ogumbuyi and Rachel Kai and all the principals of the task team for their very good work. Well, we are at a defining moment for energy politics and energy policy. In the brief, we center our attention on people's pain, but we also sympathize with governments and policymakers who are now under huge pressure. Our brief focuses, as the Secretary-General said, on realistic options in front of us. But we must be clear about one thing. Decisions by the countries that consume the most energy have global implications for the rest of the world, and especially for the smallest and poorest countries that have little influence in these markets. After 2 years of a pandemic that was marked by extreme inequality, especially in vaccines, the world cannot afford another scramble, these times on fuels. Before I go into our proposals for energy policy, I want first to say a few things about the situation as a whole that also is in the brief and that deals with the interconnected, multidimensional cost of living crisis, the worst in a generation, as we call it. Since our last press conference at the beginning of June, the situation in terms of commodity prices has improved. Crude oil is now around $93 the barrel, down from 120. Wheat prices are down almost 50% from their peak. Corn and fertilizer prices are almost 25% down from a month ago. Shipping costs are also starting to go down since June. Only natural gas has backed the trend and is still higher than a month ago. These are positive developments. As falling prices are key to breaking the vicious cycle of rising costs, rising inflation, rising interest rates, and rising poverty. There are many reasons for these price falls, but let me mention first the Black Sea Grain Initiative that the Secretary-General has led, which brought down wheat prices by 6% the day it was signed. Since then, we saw the first ship leave the port of Odessa, and today we can say prices are lower than before the deal. Falling prices are good news, but the efforts to improve the humanitarian situation are only starting. Prices have already been too high for too long. Since June, when we last met, forecasts for extreme poverty and food insecurity have risen by 21 million for poverty and 47 million for the food insecure. And we are also worried about the finance dimension of the crisis. Since inflation was rising in all regions of the world, and especially in developing countries, interest rates rise and debts, as the Secretary-General said, are becoming much more expensive to pay. Bond spreads in developing countries are increasing by 15% since June. The IMF now says that not only are 60% of low-income countries' debts in or near debt distress, but also 30% of middle-income countries' debts in or near debt distress. Also, about $40 billion have left emerging markets since the beginning of the year. And global South currencies have also depreciated against the dollar by about 5% since we last met. As a result, imports in developing countries are becoming more expensive, and domestic prices are increasing even as international prices fall. This is another sign of the interconnected nature of this crisis, of the vicious cycles we need to break. And this is proof again of the messages we have been given in this global crisis response group since the beginning. Let me go very quickly into the policy in energy and energy recommendations of our brief. Also, 4 key messages. First, in the short term, the best fuel we have is the fuel we save. On the demand side, the focus should be on reducing consumption in developed countries. This will help bring down the energy demand and allow to build reserves for winter. The decision of the European Commission last week to regulate gas consumption is a step in this direction, and we welcome it. In the brief, we propose options in these directions for transport, heating, and cooling. On the supply side, we can save almost 150 billion cubic meters of gas by reducing energy waste, such as gas flaring and methane leaks. This is close to 2,000 terawatt hours of energy per year, almost 2/3 of the EU's yearly net domestic electricity generation. Second, in developing countries, we need to make sure energy poverty does not increase and that the burden of this crisis is shared fairly and progressively. Already 1/10 of humanity has no electricity, and about 1/4 has no access to clean cooking, disproportionately affecting women and girls. Governments must target vulnerable households with publicly funded cash transfers and rebates through social protection policies. Governments should explore the most effective ways to fund these programs, including through windfall taxes on the largest oil and gas companies, whose combined profits, as the Secretary-General already emphasized, in the first quarter of this year were already close to $100 billion. And a word of warning, countries are paying attention to what others are doing. We've seen developed countries setting in place blanket subsidies at their own gas stations and reopening coal plants. There are many proposed measures in the brief to avoid this, to not compromise the long-term and sustainable goals through short-term measures. Third, in the medium term, countries need to double down and recommit to renewable energy goals. But developing countries need to be empowered to be able to transition. It is true that renewable energy is often the cheapest and most quickly deployable source of electricity for many countries. But this is only true if we ensure that supply chains work well and without bottlenecks, that the workforce has the right skills, and that enough funds will be made available for the initial investments. To meet these conditions, we have to scale up financing and technology transfer for the developing countries and the energy pool of the world. Fourth and last, the energy transition should not be a luxury to those that can afford it. According to the International Energy Agency, as was stated by the Secretary-General, annual capital spent on clean energy in developing countries need to be 7 times bigger than it is now to put the world on track to reach net zero emissions by 2050. Today, developing countries are spending around $150 billion on clean energy. They need to spend $1 trillion in investment. This is why we say governments don't need reasons to transition. As the Secretary-General said, they need options. We propose many policies in this direction, meeting the $100 billion pledge from advanced countries, ramping up development finance lending, and accelerating the deployment of funds, especially by the multilateral development banks, who also have to support countries to leverage finance from public and private sectors. Fueling lending through carbon and sustainable debt markets and government actions is needed to increase private sector funding by improving market transparency, de-risking investments, and sharing clear energy transition plans. On top of that, we have been asking since the first brief for a new emission of special drawing rights, concrete solutions to the debt crisis in the developing countries, and galvanizing the coordination of the international financial institutions. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, in a month, summer will be over and the world will enter peak energy demand season, which is winter in the northern hemisphere. As the colder months draw near, the pressure governments feel today will get even worse. The only way to relieve this pressure is by working together, by avoiding to all costs a scramble for fuels, by shielding the vulnerable from energy poverty, by managing demand in a fair and equitable way, and by investing and doubling down on the energy transition. The short term and the long term start at the same time, and that time is now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. We'll go your questions, Sherwin.
To both Secretaries General, on behalf of the UN Correspondents Association, thank you very much for this briefing. And Secretary General, welcome back from your non-vacation. You say that this report aims to achieve the energy equivalent of the Black Sea grain initiative. Do you envisage a greater facilitation role by the UN for what could be an energy initiative? What might you call that initiative? And who will be your Turkey in that instance in terms of the energy revolution that you're seeking? And you also talk about strictly time-bound policies when it comes to the reopening of these coal plants in some developed countries as a result of the war in Ukraine. But if this is a war that has no ending in sight, how can you expect time-bound policies when there's no time-bound limits on this war?
Well, first of all, the solution of the problem is not of the same nature as in relation to the food crisis. In relation to the food crisis, there was a high speculation because the Ukraine production of food was not accessible to the international markets, and Russia had banned exports of food and fertilizers, and at the same time, even if there are no sanctions on food and fertilizers, there was a number of obstacles in relation to their exports. And this led to a massive speculation. And what we did, and we see starting it as the negotiations gained credibility, was that the market started to anticipate that the prices would go down. And of course, the speculators decided to start to sell before it was too late. And so we have witnessed, since the negotiations gained traction, a fall, a significant fall. And today we have the prices, as it was said, of most foodstuffs and fertilizers more or less at the level before the war. But that doesn't mean that bread in the bakery is at the same price before the war, because these are quotations in wholesale markets, some of them related to futures. There is time between the moment in which prices go down at this level until they come to the consumer. And then there are lots of other factors that are contributing to the rising prices, namely transportation, insurance, the questions related to supply chain disruptions. And so it is good to see food prices going down in the global markets, but there will be a lot of factors that will make it difficult to translate itself into the daily life of people. What we want to do is exactly the same. It's not because there is not the same kind of physical constraints, but it is to try to create a dynamic in the markets leading to the anticipation of the understanding that we will come to a situation in which we will have an excess energy in relation to the needs. And for that, there are two things that are essential. One is reduce consumption as much as possible. And second is bet in a strong investment in renewable energy. And at the same time, I believe that because of all the speculation we are witnessing, to tax the excessive profits of oil and gas companies would give a very strong signal to the markets. And that very strong signal to the markets would help increase investment in renewables and would help, in our belief, help stabilize the markets of energy. So what we want is a number of measures that has the same impact in a different way, the same impact, which is to create the conditions for those that were speculating to understand that it's better to start changing course, because if not, in the end, they will lose a lot of money.
Thank you.
And in terms of the time-bound
I mean, if we have an adequate reduction of consumption, and if we have a meaningful increase in renewables, I think that in the very few cases where that can be justified, the time bound can be very, very limited.
Edie?
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary-General. I was listening to one of the major oil companies defend its profits, saying that oil prices had been very low for a few years, and this is part of the vagaries of the market, that prices go up and down. How are you planning? You made a very sharp criticism of their profits. How are you going to try and go about getting support from both the energy industry as it is today and governments to actually divert to renewable energy and put those excess profits into the needs of the world's poorest?
Well, many, not all, but many in the oil and gas industry have for decades denied and spent a lot of money in public relations to deny that there was an impact of fossil fuels in climate change. And obviously, prices go up and down. It is true, but go up and down in largely because of speculation and because of artificial conditions. And the truth is that we are seeing excessive, scandalous profits of oil and gas industry in a moment in which all of us are losing money. With the rate of inflation in countries like 7–8%, all of us are seeing our assets reduced, all of us are seeing our income reduced, and all of a sudden we have a group of entities that have strongly contributed to climate change that is benefiting from this situation. What we are telling is those excessive profits need to be taxed. And the money that is obtained with these taxes should be put at the disposal of those most vulnerable that are more dramatically impacted exactly by the high prices that are benefiting a limited number, a very limited number of companies in the world.
Alan Bucati, RIA Novosti.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary-General. I have two very short questions regarding Ukraine. First, Russia is asking the UN to take part in the investigation of the attack on prison in Elenivka city in Donetsk region. When the UN is going to deploy the team to take part in this investigation? And the second question is regarding the letter from Russian mission, which was submitted 2 days ago. They are notifying about that the Ukrainian armed forces are dispersing anti-personnel mines, so-called Lepestok, in Donetsk populated areas, and this might amount to terrorism, they say. What can you tell about this? How can you react on this?
Well,
thank you.
first of all, in relation to the most important point, we received the requests from the Russian Federation and the requests from the Ukraine to do an investigation in relation to the events that you have mentioned. I decided, in line with my own competencies and powers, to launch a fact-finding mission. I have not the authority to do criminal investigations, but to launch a fact-finding mission. The terms of reference for that fact-finding mission are being prepared at the present moment. They will be shared with the governments of Russia and the Federation and the government of Ukraine. I hope we'll be able to have an agreement on the terms of reference of that mission. We are at the same time looking for competent, independent people that could integrate that fact-finding mission. And we hope to have all the facilities from both sides for access and for the obtention of all data that is necessary to be able to clarify the truth about what has happened. So this is a matter that we took very seriously, and we are working hard for that. The operation has been coordinated by Courtney Ramsey because this involves a number of different aspects, from the selection of people, from logistics, from diplomatic negotiations. And as I said, not only we took very seriously that request, but we are in full moving ahead. Now, I have not acknowledged concrete data about the second aspect that you referred. The only thing we always say is that the protection of civilians is a fundamental element in any conflict, and all parties should abstain of actions that put in risk the life of civilians.
Michelle Nichols.
Thank you, Secretary-General. You've talked about taxing the oil and gas companies and using it to look after the most vulnerable people. Would the UN accept money from the oil and gas industry? And what's your message to the United States and China at a time of escalating tensions between the world's two biggest powers?
No. In relation to the first question, what we believe is that we are having excessive profits based on the sacrifice of vulnerable people around the world. And that is the reason why we believe it makes full sense to tax those companies for their excessive profits and to use that money to support the victims of the present situation. But your question was more specific.
Would the United Nations accept money from the oil and gas industry?
I can guarantee that the UN Secretariat does not. Our orientation has been for the pension fund to entirely divest from the fossil fuel system, which started by divesting from coal, and I believe they already reached full divesting from the fossil fuel industry in general. And to the agencies, I strongly recommend not to receive any contribution for those that we consider have played the most important role in the climate change. And sorry. No, I think this relates to the recent events. Our position is very clear. We abide by General Assembly resolutions, by the One China policy, and that is the orientation that we have in everything we do.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary-General. It's Pamela Falk from CBS News. My question is another piece of the taxation part of your report. You say that the report is the energy equivalent of the Black Sea Initiative, and this taxation on oil and gas companies is part of it. We've heard you answer some of the questions, but as a former prime minister, you know that governments increasing any taxation is very unpopular. To what extent have you contacted any of the big, or will contact any of the big oil and gas producing countries in order to increase that tax? And then to the other Secretary General, if I may, my understanding is you were involved and tasked with the Russian exports of fuel and food in the Black Sea Initiative. How is that going? Can you give us any updates? Thank you both.
Well, first of all, nothing will be more popular than to tax the excessive profits and oil and gas companies and to distribute that money to the most vulnerable families. So I don't think there is any problem of popularity in relation to this mission. There is a problem of lobbying against, and sometimes lobbies are very powerful, and they have strong influence in the way policies are defined, and we all know how that thing sometimes happens, and it's probably not very dignifying. But about popularity, I can guarantee this would be extremely popular. And I mean, we have been talking naturally to countries, but it's not only the oil-producing countries. I mean, I'm talking about the profits of the companies. And the companies that operate in different countries do not necessarily belong to those countries. I'm talking about the profits of the private operators in relation to this.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Rebecca. Go ahead, Rebecca. Yeah.
Can I support what the Secretary General is saying also that I think that is very widely, sorry, this is the sun getting to my face. Okay. Here in Geneva. There is wide consensus in the economic field that when you have windfall profits, you need to tax them while the prices are excessively high, not because of cost of production, increases. And so the Secretary General is absolutely right. This is good economic policy to tax windfall profits. And in this case, there is the moral imperative that the Secretary General has put forward precisely to support, the most vulnerable households if we have to have targeted social protection measures for them that have to be financed. And this is a very clear and direct source of finance. With respect to Russia and to the facilitation of trade in food and fertilizers from the Russian Federation, we are working hard and we are trying to take away the obstacles that they face in terms of finance, of insurance, of shipping and transport. And some of the clarifications have been already enacted by the US and by the EU with respect to the sanctions that are in place. What we need is clarifications so the private sector will understand what are the conditions under which they can make those activities and those commercial endeavors. So we are working hard on that, and some clarifications have already been published, and that will help also for us to continue our work.
Thank you.
At the risk of the SG firing me, I'm going to sneak in one last question before we release him. Edward, please go ahead.
Hi, Secretary General. This is De Zhi with China Central Television. Just now, when you make your opening remarks, you talked about recommendations that you said it would be equivalent to the Black Sea Grain Deal initiative. I'm just wondering, in short term, do you expect your recommendations really had any effect on the energy crisis? And is there any possibilities for the United Nations to, let's say, just like the Black Sea Grain Initiative, to break a deal with Russia? Because energy, speaking of the resource of energy, Russia is still a big exporter in the market. Will you break a deal with Russia to export, energy to the European countries? That would, ease the crisis. Thank you.
I believe the question is global. I mean, I don't think we can look into the Russian-European relationship. I think the question is global. It has to do with the availability of the different sources of energy globally. And for that, I believe the measures that we have announced should lead the markets to stabilization and the reduction of prices, independently of the specificities of the relationship between the Russian Federation and the European Union.
Thank you. Sir, we have to let you go, and Rebecca will take some more questions.
Thank you very much.
Back to vacation?
I'm going to Japan, to Hiroshima, and then I will visit two countries because of this is linked to the non-proliferation. I will go to the Republic of Korea and to Mongolia, because Mongolia is a country that has had a very positive role in getting connection with DPRK. So it says, huh?
No stops in Taiwan.
Let's go.
No. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great. Kristen, Salome.
Thank you, Stefan. Kristen from Al Jazeera here. Secretary General, last time you were here, I believe the main concern regarding food insecurity had to do with distribution and, of course, increasing prices. Now, obviously, the UN's helped tackle some of that issue. But I'm wondering, given the ongoing conflict, reduced fertilizer exports, weather concerns are continuing, we had a situation in Sri Lanka where food production fell way below what they normally do. Are you worried that there could be global food shortages in the near future? And given what happened in Sri Lanka, I was hoping to ask the Secretary General, given what happened in Sri Lanka where there was an attempt to mandate greener farming and that resulted in so much lower food output, are you worried that this message of sticking to the Paris Agreement goals, trying to reach the climate goals, how do you reassure countries that they can do that and still have enough food? Thanks.
Thank you very much. It's a very important question. We think that we can avoid the food shortages if we are able to take the obstacles away from the fertilizer market. And we think that that is possible, and we are working on that. So for the moment, we don't have shortfalls of food. Our worry was that if the prices of fertilizers continue to go up, and the demand of fertilizers will go down, because the problem is that because of the price, the demand of fertilizers was going down dramatically in many parts of the world. Now prices of fertilizers have eased a little, and we think that we can ease that pressure even more. If we get back to the demand, the normal demand levels, there is no reason why we have to face shortfalls in the next harvest. But I want to caution, we need to bring prices even farther down for that to happen. And precisely the agreement that we reached between the UN and Russia and the agreement on the Black Sea target the fertilizer sector very specifically for that to happen. Now, with respect to what happened in Sri Lanka, and I want to be very, very clear on that. First of all, it's true that they had a bad policy with respect to fertilizers, because you have to make the transition possible, like it was said in the food systems fora, the summit that was held at the beginning of this year. You can do things in the right way or in the wrong way. You can have the right policies, even if you have an important objective, if the implementation of that objective, is supporting bad policies, that you will have a problem. The main problem in Sri Lanka came through the financial dimension, not necessarily because they didn't have enough food produce in Sri Lanka, but because they couldn't buy it, because they were more dependent on imports. Sure, if you want to bring production inside the country and increase production inside the country, the combination of policies that Sri Lanka implemented will not be the ones that will be advised by us. But it's not because they used, you know, a more biofertilizers and sustainable fertilizers. It was because there was no training, there was no support, there was no finance, and it was done in a way in which many didn't know how to really use the new techniques for doing that. So I think that it will be rushing a conclusion to say, oh, we will have to continue to rely on phosphate fertilizers forever. No, there is a transition going on, but we have to make the transition in the right way and with the right support for farmers and small farmers. And maybe my last point on this is we need to put more research into it, yes, to scale up production, because the production of sustainable fertilizers that don't rely on fossil fuels is still to be reached. We are not there yet.
Thank you. Mario, FA?
Thank you, Mario Villar con la agencia EFE. On the report, you propose measures to control the energy demand in the short term, things like limiting AC, heating, transportation. There's a debate in several countries happening right now about plans by governments to do these kinds of things. What would you say to the people and the political parties that are opposing this type of measures?
Well, for example, you know, who is going to be really opposed to not putting the air conditioner at 18 degrees, but at 21 or 22? You know, why should you oppose something like that? You can be fresh at home. You can help the world. You can save fuels. You can, you know, rationalize demand. I don't know about you, but I have been in too many places where I suffer from cold being in a warm country. So that doesn't make sense. Rationalizing demand doesn't have to be, you know, controversial. Why will it be not, you know, a reasonable thing to do, for example, with air conditioning? Or, for example, with having the, you know, in winter, your house too warm. If you can be comfortable at, you know, reducing 1 centigrade in the temperature. Those are measures that we all know that make sense, that are rational, and that is about also, you know, fostering awareness on the consumers and on people, but also on having the right messaging from the leadership. You know, leadership is very important in these moments, and coordination of policies is very important around the world. I don't see why this should be controversial. All the measures that we put in the report are measures that are concrete, that are practical, that can have a very important impact in the short term, and that I honestly don't see why should not be embraced by the governments of the world.
Thank you. Mr. Abadi, and then we'll go back to you.
Thank you very much.
If you could Mr. Abadi, if you could take off your mask when you ask the question, because it's hard to hear. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this briefing. The Secretary-General introduced the element of morality in business profit, and it's always a sensitive issue. There is also the element of fairness. Who decides what level of profit should be taxed? And did the Secretary-General have in mind an international tax?
Yes, in this brief, there have been many discussions about international taxation. Yes, that's a separate discussion. In this brief, we talk about domestic taxes to support the poor households of the world. We are not talking about international taxation. But there are other spaces where international taxation is being discussed, but we haven't discussed that in this brief. We talk about domestic taxation. And there are different methodologies to calculate windfall profits, yes? Because you have comparisons of the behavior in normal markets. So you can normalize the price given by the market. By the market, it's not an arbitrary price. There are methodologies to do that and to calculate the windfall profit. And this taxation is temporary taxation because if prices go down again, so obviously the windfall profit disappears. Yeah, so you have to be sensible to that possibility. But they are methodologies, and they are very sound methodologies in the economic profession to do that well. And it will have to be done at the country level, not at the international level, because the conditions of the market and the windfall profit calculation will be different in each situation.
Thank you. Edie?
Thank you, Ms. Greenspan. I'd like to go back to what you told Pamela about the Russian agreement with the UN on trying to get their grain and fertilizer to global markets. Can you tell us whether there have actually been any shipments from Russia as a result of this deal? I realize that this is all commercial, but so is the Black Sea Initiative. Has the deal with the UN made any significant difference? Are there ships lined up, ships waiting? Do they need to be loaded? Are they waiting for agreements? Thank you.
Thank you, Edie, for that question. I cannot give you that information right now, but let me address the question because I think it's an important question. First of all, there were exports of grain and fertilizers coming out from Russia, yes? But the cost of transactions of those shipments of grain and fertilizers are very high. And that's why prices are also affected. You know, half of the increases in the price of grains comes from increases in transport and logistic costs. So precisely that is the pressure that we want to ease. It's not that exports were not happening, but they were happening at very high transaction costs. So that is the first thing to your answer. The second is that it's true that part of what we want to make happen is more ships coming into the Russian ports for the exports of food and fertilizers, because if those ships come in, then not only the volumes, but the cost, as I said, the price will go down. That is too soon to happen because there are still bottlenecks that we need to remove. The clarifications that have been already provided by the EU and by the US will have to go to the private sector that is evaluating the situation as we speak. Remember, these are not government transactions. These are commercial transactions. It's not, contracts with governments. These are contracts of the private sector. So what we need to see happening is that the actors in the private sector will evaluate the situation today differently than before the agreement, and that there will see conditions to resume the exports of food and fertilizers from the Russian Federation. Because there is a lot of what we have described is a chilling effect on the private sector. So an important part of the private sector has stopped their dealings in food and fertilizer. That is what we are talking about with the Russian Federation. There is still, you know, a road to be traveled in that sense.
So that's the major bottleneck, still getting the private sector to accept that this deal will enable these transactions to occur without the threat of sanctions.
Yes.
Thank you. We're going to take two more questions online. Joe Klein, are you here? Joe? Okay. Iftikhar Ali, are you on?
Yes, Steph, thank you. Can you hear me?
Perfectly, Iftikhar. Go ahead.
In your in your opening remarks, you have highlighted the plight of developing countries, where domestic prices, according to you, are increasing while the prices are falling on international markets. Not only that, the developing countries are being hit by impacts of climate change like floods and fires, while they are still struggling to overcome the impact of COVID pandemic, while struggling to deal with the increasing debt issue. Apart from the measures that you have outlined, what more can be done to meet this extraordinary situation of the developing country? Thank you.
Go ahead, Rebecca.
What else can we do?
What can be done?
What more can be done?
Yeah.
Yes, no, thank you very much for your questions. Yes, in fact, domestic prices can go up while international prices go down because there are currency depreciations that are happening in the developing countries, precisely because the interest there are interest rate increases in the developed countries, and so there are several things happening. One is capital flight to the advanced economies that is devaluating the currencies, and also because of the strength of the dollar that is devaluating currencies in the developing world. So that's why domestic prices can go up while international prices in dollars go down. And so in the national currencies, prices can go up. What else can be done? We have been very emphatic that the developing countries need liquidity now. They need liquidity because they have a trade deficit going up because of the problems of the prices of food and fertilizers and energy, but also because they need to support their poorer and most vulnerable households. And they don't have fiscal space after the pandemic. So liquidity today, not only the issue of solvency, but the issue of liquidity of capital importance. And for that, the best tool that the international community has is the special drawing rights, even if they are badly distributed, because they are badly distributed, because most of these special drawing rights go to the advanced economies. But the amount that goes for the developing countries is still a very significant amount that can really ease the pain and cushion the flow for the developing world. So that is a very important one. And the second one, obviously, is to extend the DSSI for the non-payment of interest of the low-income countries. But what we are saying is that we want to extend the DSSI, extending also the maturity of the loans. Because if not, you will have a snowball in the future. So more liquidity immediately, and also extending the DSSI for the low-income countries as a bridge to a restructuring of the debt problem in the future. Because right now, we only have 3 countries that have come into the debt restructuring framework that the G20 agreed to. Imagine if not only in 2 years we have 3 countries. Imagine if we have 60% of the low-income countries and 30% of the middle-income countries coming to a process of debt restructuring. The framework is not yet fit for purpose. So the DSSI can be, with longer maturities, can be a good bridge for a more orderly process for debt restructuring for the countries that are on the brink of another debt crisis.
Great. Rebecca, thank you very much, and thank all of you for participating. Thank you, and have a good afternoon, rather. Thank you.
Thank you very much.